Welcome back to Outside View Scandals. Today we're plunging into one of the darkest chapters in human history, both literally and metaphorically. We're talking about the Black Death, a pandemic so catastrophic that it wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. But this isn't just about the plague itself. Oh no, this is about the scandalous way people handled it, or rather mishandled it. And spoiler alert, when you don't understand a disease, blaming minorities seems to have been the go-to strategy. But let's set the scene. In the mid-1300s, and Europe is thriving, kind of. There are bustling cities, vibrant trade routes, and yes, a fair share of questionable hygiene practices. Enter the Black Death, an uninvited guest arriving via fleas on rats aboard trading ships. Within months, the disease spread like wildfire, leaving death and devastation in its wake. Imagine a pandemic hitting a world with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no concept of germ theory. It's safe to say people were a bit unprepared. But instead of trying to figure out what was actually causing the plague, the fleas, the rats, the lack of sanitation, many Europeans decided to take the easy route. Blame someone else. And who better to blame than those who were already marginalized? Jews, lepers, Romani people, and other minorities quickly became scapegoats for the disaster. One of the most infamous accusations was that Jews were poisoning wells to spread the plague. Yeah, because obviously in a time when people barely knew how water worked, the idea of a coordinated well poisoning campaign was entirely plausible. And this baseless claim led to horrific consequences. Jewish communities across Europe were attacked, with thousands of people massacred or expelled from their homes. In Strasbourg, for example, over 900 Jews were burned alive in 1349, months before the plague even reached the city. Talk about jumping to conclusions. The logic behind this scapegoating was, to put it mildly, flawed. In reality, Jewish communities were often less affected by the plague, not because of some sinister plot, but because of their religious practices. Ritual cleanliness, dietary laws, and separate living quarters likely reduced their exposure to the disease. But instead of seeing this as a clue to effective hygiene practices, it was twisted into evidence of guilt. It's the medieval equivalent of, "Why aren't you sick like the rest of us? You must be up to something." Of course, the church didn't exactly help matters. While some clergy members tried to protect Jewish communities, others were more than happy to fan the flames. And by fan the flames, I mean literally in some cases. Pope Clement VI did issue papal bulls condemning the violence and pointing out that the plague was in fact a natural disaster. But let's be honest, papal decrees were about as effective as yelling "stop it" in a hurricane. But it wasn't just Jews who suffered. Lepers, already outcast in society, became another target. Their skin conditions made them easy to single out, and many were brutally murdered or driven out of their communities. Romani people faced similar persecution, as did anyone who didn't fit the mold of the ideal medieval European citizen. And if you were a woman who happened to be a bit too independent or outspoken, well, congratulations, you were probably accused of being a witch. What makes the scandal even more infuriating is how preventable it all was. The Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but the violence and persecution that accompanied it were entirely man-made. Instead of coming together to face a common enemy, the disease, society tore itself apart, blaming the most vulnerable. And it's a pattern we've seen throughout history, and one that sadly persists in different forms today. And let's not forget the economic angle. For many leaders, blaming minorities wasn't just about fear or ignorance, it was also incredibly convenient. By accusing Jews or other groups of causing the plague, they could justify confiscating property, cancelling debts, and consolidating power. It's the ultimate medieval playbook. Create a crisis, find a scapegoat, profit. The legacy of the scandal is a sobering reminder of what happens when fear and ignorance take the wheel. The Black Death itself eventually subsided, but the scars it left, both physical and societal, lasted for generations. Entire communities were wiped out, not just by the disease, but by the violence it unleashed. And while we'd like to think we've moved past this kind of scapegoating, history has a funny way of repeating itself. So, what can we learn from the Black Death blame scandal? First, that ignorance and fear are a dangerous combination. When people don't understand what's happening, they are more likely to look for someone to blame rather than a solution. And second, that the most vulnerable members of society often bear the brunt of crises, whether it's fair or not. And finally, that pointing fingers is easy, but it's rarely productive, especially when the real culprit is a flea on a rat. So thank you for tuning in to Outside View Scandals, where we uncover the stories that remind us of humanity's capacity for both brilliance and blunders. And remember, the next time you are tempted to blame someone else for your problems, maybe double check if there's a rat in the room first. Until next time, and the next video is already right here in the end screen.